Hello and welcome to Now and Zen. Today our guest is Denny Genovese, and he is a pioneer in the area of just intonation and polyrhythms. And in addition to having a thesis about that, he's released much of his own music and created many of his own instruments in what is known as the Exotic Music Ensemble. Welcome, Denny. It's so great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Stephen, and I'm honored to be here. Looking at your website and seeing uh, the tremendous work you're doing, I feel honored that you're interested in my work.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Well, it's just so great to be having this conversation. And I've got so much respect for all of the things that you've done, especially sort of in an earlier time period where it was a lot harder to access the tools necessary in order to be able to do this stuff. Can you talk about what it was like to work with Ivor Darreg?
Yeah. I thought it was a very, very interesting man. Um, he had so many interests. Microtonal music was only one of them, really. Um, but it's the one he's most remembered for. But he was also a mathematician, and he actually developed a code. He made sure that we understood the difference between calling it a code and a language for actually speaking mathematics. Um, rather than speaking about mathematics the way we generally do, like we say, 9 divided by 5, that sort of thing. Um, he had a really efficient language that was all one syllable words that represented all of the mathematical symbols and operations. And he had made sure that they didn't conflict with um, words in any of the various languages that he spoke. He spoke a whole lot of languages. I don't even remember how many, but an amazing number of languages that he spoke. Um, and so he was able to make his Numato code um, such that it was very efficient. He could take a really long equation and just state it in a short sequence of syllables that could not be mistaken for words in any of the languages that he knew.
Wow, that's like literally so mind blowing that I can't even fathom it. It seems it definitely fits him, I think, and a lot of other microtonalists I know who are really interested in not only mathematics but also things like conlangs and ways to modify language a little bit to make things more efficient, even if not a lot of other people use them.
Yeah, unfortunately, nobody seemed to adopt Numato code, but uh, it was pretty amazing to me. I guess, anything new, can be uh, hard to get across. Um, some people actually said that there wasn't any need for it, but I didn't understand that argument.
Is that code that he created, is it listed somewhere, like on the internet or in a document anywhere?
Well, he did write a he wrote a pamphlet about it, and he sent it out to most of his correspondents, including myself. Um, but and I still have it somewhere, but um, I've moved so many times that I've had to pack things up, and I'm not even sure exactly where it is or how I would get to it if I did know where it was. Well, the World Harmony Project website used to have it, but the website went down a few years ago, and I haven't gotten it back up again yet. But it was on that website. Um, Jonathan Glacier might have a copy of it.
Maybe some of our listeners, some of them might know more details on that. A lot of times we've had a podcast episode and there's been a question about something in particular, and then there's somebody who will just sort of swoop in and answer it. So I also of course want to ask you about not just your microtonal music but also the instruments that you've created. You created the Exotic Music Ensemble, is that right?
Yes, that was my performing group in Gainesville, Florida, back in the early '90s. Um, the idea was I had just come from New College, where I had finally gotten a digital synthesizer that was microtunable, and on my way to that, I had developed a computer program called Microtonal MIDI Terminal, which could actually trick a um, an equal tempered synthesizer into playing in just intonation um, polyphonically. And that program was adopted by several um, microtonal composers. It became the inspiration for a few other programs. Mine was written on the IBM platform in DOS, uh, and then when Windows became the standard, um, then uh, my program didn't work anymore because it was in DOS, which was the foundation that Windows was built on. Um, but my program addressed the sound card directly, whereas Windows would um, would address it indirectly, um, and so my program would get lost. My MIDI messages would get lost in the Windows maze. The surviving program, there was one written for the Macintosh that used the um, the um, uh, the basic idea, but it was for the old Macintosh and it didn't last. Um, and then uh, the one program that's surviving now that does some of what my program did and a whole lot of other things is programmed by an English programmer, Fractal Tune Smithy.
Oh, yes, I know about Fractal Tune Smithy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really difficult program to understand because it does so many things. You know, you can set it up to do one thing, and then you try to do another thing with it, and the settings will be wrong. So, um, but Robert knew that, and so he set up a system where you could have several different shortcuts that you could use to come to the program from different angles and use different functions of it depending on which shortcut you use to get to it. The two things that I was most interested in was he he developed a means for tuning equal tempered synthesizers using the principles that I use, but in a somewhat different, more modern way. And then later, Barbara Hero and her friend Robert Falkrod had developed a Lambdoma keyboard, and uh, they loaned me one to work with. And meanwhile, I asked Robert if he would be interested in developing an interface between their keyboard and Fractal Tune Smithy. And he did that, and we worked on it for several months, developing that aspect of his program, and it got to where it was working pretty well. And along the way, we also developed ways to use the computer keyboard to also interface the Lambdoma section of his program that we had developed for the Lambdoma keyboard. And so anyway, I highly recommend Robert's program if any microtonalist. I know that the name might sound kind of strange. It did to me, at least. I thought, well, Fractal Tunes, it was, on the. It reminded me too much of random music, and I wasn't into random music very much, but that's just one aspect of the program.
Yeah, yeah. So then, I might be getting this mixed up. A Lambda keyboard. I want to say I've seen pictures of that. Does it look like a normal Halberstadt keyboard, but there are some black keys and some like yellow keys that are raised like black keys? Maybe I'm thinking of something
No,
else.
no,
No, something
no.
else. Yeah.
No, the Lambdoma, Lambdoma, was also known as the Pythagorean table.
Oh, I see.
And it was the model that Harry Partch used for his tonality diamond.
Yes, I've seen this pattern. Anna Maria Hefele, who does a lot of overtone singing, used this pattern to generate an entire chime instrument recently. The instrument she made, it's almost like hanging like from the ceiling, just individual chimes for each note. And then all of the
Oh,
chimes are on the same enclosure. And the sculpturing was also aided by her husband Joseph.
okay, I can sort of visualize that. Yeah.
It's a really, really beautiful sculpture. It's a great music and video. She got to sort of improvise in it and walk around and play the chimes. It's very meditative. I think you would really dig it.
Yeah, that sounds real interesting. Um, you asked me about the Exotic Music Ensemble, and I digressed into my computer programs. But that was foundational for the album that I created as part of my thesis project at New College, um, which was uh, an album that I called PRMJ, PRMJI, I'm sorry. And uh, a lot of people thought it was a Hindi word or Sanskrit word or something like that. But actually, it was initials for polyrhythmic music in just intonation. And that accompanied my thesis, which was called the Natural Harmonic Series, as a practical approach to just intonation. And uh, that was my primary theoretical work to this day, but it's not currently available. I still have some work to do on the more newer edition. I was using a program to do the graphics, and I almost had the cover made, and that was going to be the last step. But then the program stopped working, and the uh, the, the the author of the program disappeared, and so I bogged down, and so it's currently bogged at the moment. But anyway, I slightly revised it, added a whole lot of pictures and new diagrams and stuff like that, and was going to have a color cover, and wrote uh, a forward to it, explaining the developments that had happened since the time that I wrote it. Um, but until I get the cover put together again, find another program to make the cover with, and stuff like that is sort of not available. Um, there are several copies that people have. Most of the microtonalists that I knew back in the 90s have a copy, or at least they had a copy. I don't know if they still do. Um, but yeah, anyway, it exists. It's just not uh, very available.
I think our listeners are definitely interested in hearing all of this stuff, and are probably fascinated by how you arrived at what you did in your thesis as well, and what kinds of maybe specific polyrhythms and tuning techniques you were using. So, if you wouldn't mind, would you want to talk a little bit about which systems of just intonation you use and why, and how that made appearances in the album? Something that I definitely want to track down now, having not known about its existence before this conversation.
Well, I first found out about just intonation when I discovered Harry Parker's book at the Graduate Music Library in University of Hawaii. My quest for just intonation began in 1968. Um, at that time, I was playing in a rock band in South Chicago, um, using an electric guitar that I had built in high school woodshop, and amplifier that I had built uh, because I didn't have much money and couldn't afford to buy instruments which were just, well, I grew up in a rather low income family, if you want to call it that, and so I had to be as resourceful as possible, and I wound up making a lot of the things that I wound up using. But anyway, I was playing in this rock band, and I eventually noticed that when I would tune the guitar in the prescribed way, tuning the E string first and then using the fifth fret as a guide for the open uh, fifth string, and then using that process to tune the guitar. I would notice that it just didn't sound exactly right. I was looking for a more resonant sound than that tuning method gave me, and so I would tweak it so that when I played an E chord, it was really strong and resonant, and there weren't any beats between any of the notes. And I found that the A chord worked very well as also uh, in that tuning, and that I could use bar chords all the way up the neck, and they would all be strong and resonant like that. But if I tried playing C chords or G chords or other chords that differed in the fingering, I would not only get the terrible beats, but it would be noticeably out of tune. And I always thought at that time it was that I had just built the guitar improperly. That the frets were in the wrong positions or something. I just didn't understand what was going on at the time. I was just using my ears. Um, but shortly uh, on, I, um, I was reading a magazine called the San Francisco Oracle, and it had an article by Mike Pinder, who was the founder and keyboard player of the Moody Blues, which was a band that I really loved at the time. They integrated the sound of Western classical music into rock and roll, and they also integrated in their second album, uh, In Search of the Lost Chord, they integrated sitar and other exotic instruments. And by that time, they were right out front about being spirited. Um, they even had the last song on the album, which was the longest one, uh, was named Aum, and the name of the album was In Search of the Lost Chord, which referred to that sacred syllable of Hindu um, origin. Um, but anyway, in this article, he was describing musical devices, techniques that the Moody Blues would use in their concerts in order to produce certain effects in the audience. He talked about physiological effects from different chord progressions that he would use and that sort of thing. And then he also talked about psychological um, effects that he could get in various ways. And it was a long time ago, so I don't remember the details to be able to spell them out, but they were there. And if you can get hold of um, uh, old issues of the San Francisco Oracle, which stopped publishing probably in 1970 or something like that. But they might be available. You might find that article and be able to read it. But anyway, toward the end of the article, he mentioned there was even a combination of tones that would produce a bowel movement. And
The famous brown note.
yeah, and he assured us they never used it in concerts, but that gave me so much inspiration because I had already been very interested in natural health. Um, I was already my grandmother had been an herbalist, and one of my aunts was also, and I had been doing massage by intuition ever since I was a kid. Whenever anybody had um, any kind of sore muscles, I would just massage them and help them with that. So the idea of being able to produce a bowel movement, well, that's one of the problems that a lot of people have, is that they're constipated. So I wanted to learn about that. And so I went on the search, and I realized too that if that was true, if it could really happen, then that implied that music had all kinds of healing powers. So that was how I began my search for the keys of how to do it. And I already had the experience of the resonance with the guitar um, as my initial clues, but I didn't know they were related to each other at the time. Um, so um, time went on, and eventually my father had taught me the basics of electricity when I was 8 years old, and I was helping him wire houses by the time I was 10. And um, so I was building Heathkit. I don't know if anybody would remember Heathkit, but it was a really wonderful way for somebody who was interested in electronics to be able to learn about it um, by actually building things. Mostly it was ham radio stuff, but um, I learned the basics of electronics by building Heathkits. And so by the time of the mid 1970s, I was very interested in electronic music, and it didn't exist the way it does now. It was something that was performed in very few radio stations and laboratories in the various parts of the world. There was one in France, and there was one in Princeton, and there was one in San Francisco, um, and there were probably some more. But anyway, it was really expensive stuff, most of it hand built, that or using test equipment in various combinations to get effects, and it was mostly beeps and blurps, and wasn't very interesting from an ordinary musical perspective, but it did demonstrate the possibility that you could create almost any sound you could imagine uh, electronically. So I got real interested in that, and I started building synthesizer um, um, uh, modules and using them along with my test equipment to create my experiments in electronic music. And eventually, um, I had been building these things long enough to where I put together a really good synthesizer, a really well working synthesizer, on a par, I would say, with ARP and Moog. Um, but it was custom made, and um, as I would play this um, in Honolulu, where I lived in the 70s, um, some people would come to me and ask where the synthesizer came from, and I would tell them I made it, and they'd ask if I could make one for them, and so I did, and gradually uh, developed my technique. And um, meanwhile, my search continued for the link between music and health and healing. Um, and I thought that electronic would probably be a principal key because it unlocked the, the physics of sound and gave me more freedom than the acoustic instruments would, or even the electric instruments that we were using in the rock bands in the 60s. Um, so in the 70s, I was playing uh, Don Sleppy and I had started an organization in Honolulu called um, the Hawaii Electronic Music Group. And we put on workshops and made recordings. And eventually we were maintaining the electronic music studio at University of Hawaii. And um, I ran into a woman at the food co-op who I didn't know why, but I was just really attracted to her. She was about maybe 30 years older than me, so it wasn't a sexual attraction. It was on a spiritual level, and we got talking, just because she was attracted to me too. Found out that she was the principal violist in the Honolulu Symphony, and that she had a long background in actually using her viola for healing. And so that really was interesting to me, and I told her about what my quest was, and we got to know each other, and eventually she hired me to be her assistant. And after a while, um, she knew that I really wanted to I had been reading about the electronic music studios all over the mainland United States, and that I wanted to go and research. I wanted to meet the people who were doing it and see the instruments that they were using and try to learn something. And along the way, I wanted to stop at some spiritual centers and check in with them and learn what I could. And so she actually funded on a very minimal basis a 2-month odyssey using the Greyhound bus um, system to tour the United States and actually do that and stop at all the major cities that had music libraries, um, so that I could, see what was in the libraries and read anything that was pertinent. Um, and so she bought me this 2-month Greyhound bus pass, which allowed me to travel in total freedom anytime I wanted to on any bus going anywhere in the United States for 2 months. And so I started in San Francisco, and she came with me to San Francisco, and we met Daniel Kolbiaka, who was the uh, um, first violinist in the San Francisco Symphony. And he was also very interested in music as a healing, and that's how he and Maxine knew each other. And then came to find out that he had a synthesizer. It was uh, EMS, I think that's the name of it. It's called the electronic easel, and it was from England. It was one of the very few commercially available synthesizers at the time, and I compared it with my homemade synthesizer, and it had some features that mine didn't, and of course mine had some features that it didn't. So I got to know Daniel, and we became really good friends really fast. And I told him about the tour, that he was the first stop on my tour, and so he gave me some more leads. He told me about a friend of his who was a professor of music at San Jose State University, and he was administrating a electronic music studio that used Buchla equipment. So uh, he put me in touch with Alan Strange, who was the composer that administrated that studio. And I went down to San Jose on the bus, and he came to the bus depot and picked me up, and brought me home. And oh, by the way, Daniel and his wife Mashiko were very uh, welcoming to me, and I stayed with them overnight and spent the next day with Daniel, just really having a good time talking about all our common interests. And spent one more night, and then left the next morning to go down to see Alan Strange. And so Alan picked me up and brought me to his house, and we had a really good time discussing electronic music. I told him about the Hawaii Electronic Music Group, which he was really interested in, and I told him about the different studios I wanted to visit, and he gave me some insight into the nature of some of those studios, and also recommended a few more that were not yet on my list. And then he took me over to the the university studio. He had a smaller studio in his garage, which was also very well equipped and very interesting. And then he took me to the studio at the university and had a big modular Buchla system and multi-track tape recorders and such things like that, and demonstrated it for me, and uh, showed me how it worked. And so all this was really, really interesting to me. Um, and I later incorporated some of the things that I learned on this tour into my own synthesizers, and made them better. Um, so the tour went on. I went to Los Angeles and went to um, somewhere in Nevada, went somewhere in Arizona, just crisscrossed and wandered around all through the United States. There was a very interesting electronic music studio in Salt Lake City also. Of course, UCLA had a huge one. Um, but anyway, one of the interesting things about the one in Salt Lake City was that they had developed a sort of a variation on the oscilloscope, so that they could see the music. Well, that was a standard practice in electronic music, was to look at your waveforms with an oscilloscope. but they had a way of sort of translating it into music notation, and it wasn't very good notation, but you could at least tell, what pitches were being played, which
Would
was
would it be like a piano roll looking thing, or are you meaning like music notation on the page, like Western sheet music?
yeah, it was almost more like a piano roll. Um, and so that was interesting. Eventually, I wound up at uh, um, I think it was the University of Indiana in southern Indiana in what's the name of that city? Bloomington.
Oh,
And
like IU.
yeah. When I got there, I met up with Don Bird, who was the administrator of a computer music project, which was very rare in those days. Um, this was 1975. It was the summer of 1975. And so he was interested to see the uh, the results of a program that I had done on a big mainframe at the University of Hawaii, that composed sort of random music, and uh, and made a very rudimentary music notation that kind of resembled um, uh, uh, standard Western music notation, but was very primitive. But anyway, it was pretty advanced for the time, and he was very interested in that development. And then he um, introduced me to a program that he had written that did a very similar thing, but a whole lot better. And it composed stochastic music, which was a popular thing in um, electronic music studios at that time, which um, didn't didn't it de-emphasized the importance of pitch relationships in order to focus more on relationships of timbre and dynamics and rhythm and other aspects of music that were not usually in prime focus. Of course, I was at the time I was interested in that because it was different than anything I knew. Um, though eventually I got tired of it and wanted to hear more pitches again. I love pitch relationships.
Yeah. Did you think your interest in pitches sparked your movement into just intonation?
Most certainly. Um, but I don't want to digress into that right now. I'd like to continue on the 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 um, the outline of
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 course.
how the, of how this music developed.
Yes.
Um, and so I knew there was hope for um, electronic and computer music, and I wanted to um, be able to use computers to control the analog synthesizers. So that became one of my goals, and I continued on with this tour, and eventually wound up at the Columbia Princeton Music Studio um, at Columbia University in New York City. So at the Columbia Princeton studio, I met Vladimir Ussachevsky, who I had heard previously on an album of electronic music that I found in the library at the University of Hawaii. Um, and it was the only album of electronic music that I was able to find or that I had ever heard of at the time. And I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the pieces on that album was written by my friend Don Slepian's father, who worked at Bell Telephone Laboratories, which was the premier acoustic research facility in the United States and possibly in the world. And he had gotten a computer to actually sing the old folk song Daisy, bicycle built for two.
Oh, that's the classic.
You know that piece? Yeah.
Well, I think it's the where I know that's referenced in a piece of popular media. I want to say Space Odyssey. Like the computer singing Daisy for the first time, and it was like a huge historical moment.
That was Don Slepian's father who did that.
Wow.
And um, and his father before him had been involved with Alexander Graham Bell and what was his name? The other guy, Edison, um, who they he had to he had been working with Edison for a while, but he moved over and got more interested in Tesla. This was Don's grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
because Tesla was into alternating current, while Edison was interested in DC current. And the problem was that DC was cleaner by far, and less destructive to the equipment, but it had very short range. So his plan was to build a power station every square mile, which would have been really expensive and, probably wouldn't have worked out. I never got to visit Bell Laboratories, but that was an aside that Don's um, father had worked there. And later Don worked there, developing um, a computer synthesizer. It was an actual digital synthesizer. It was actually the first digital synthesizer that was ever built. But anyway, yeah, I met Vladimir Wyszynski at the Columbia Princeton studio, and he introduced me to his Buchla. And I told him about how I had seen the Buchla in San Jose, and he thought that was really fun. And and then I went on to, I was always taking pictures and learning as much as I could. Sometimes I would get tape recordings of the people I was visiting when they were willing to be on tape that I later played on my radio show in Honolulu. Um, but anyway, I went to, while I was in New York City, I went to Composers Recordings Incorporated. It was a record a record label that was actually founded and owned and operated by composers rather than uh, uh, lawyers and business people like that.
Now that's inspiring, especially now.
Yeah, and so I told them about the journey I was on, and played them some of my music that I had created in Hawaii and showed them pictures of my synthesizers. Um, Told them about my radio show, and so they agreed to send a package of all of their electronic music and much of their experimental music um, to the radio station where my show was, so that when I got back to Honolulu, went back to work at the radio station, all these records were waiting for me, and the station manager was just beside himself. You know, how did you get all these records? Because they were sent to me in care of the studio.
Tell us about the Exotic Music Ensemble.
There were two versions of the Exotic Music Ensemble. The first one proceeded from the time that I just described. That was in Honolulu, Hawaii in the 1970s. And then the second Exotic Music Ensemble was in Gainesville, Florida in the 1990s after I had graduated from New College in Sarasota, Florida. And that's where I wrote my thesis and created the album PRMJI and wrote my thesis. Um, and the program microtonal MIDI terminal. But anyway, yeah, back in Honolulu, I used the organ as the basis for tuning, and immediately built a xylophone with wooden blocks. And or actually before that, I tuned up some tubular bells. I used aluminum tubing and cut it to length to create diatonic scales in Tubalon and got them to match with the keyboard. And then built the wooden uh, xylophone. And then, inspired by Harry Partch's harmonic cannons, I built a couple of different instruments that were similar to that, but since I was working with diatonic at the time, because it was right at the beginning of my quest, and that was what I was most familiar with. I knew Parch had used 43 tones in his octave, and that it was very much more complex than what I was even able to imagine at the time. But I thought I'd start with what I could understand, which was the diatonic. And so I built some what I called melodic cannons that were tuned in the diatonic scale, but they had moving bridges, uh, movable bridges, I should say, like some of his harmonic cannons had. So I could play diatonic scale in one key and then move the bridge to play a parallel scale in another key. And so I experimented quite a bit with that. And then I expanded on the what Irv Wilson called a tubalone, which was the tubular bells made of aluminum. Um, and I got some old fence posts, aluminum fence posts that I had found somebody had thrown them out, and I hung them up on a rack and played them with mallets and got myself some chimes, and then tuned the lengths of those so that they matched. And then I had been working at a theater in Sarasota just before I went to New College, and they were throwing out a piano. And I asked if I could get some parts off of it before they threw it out, and they said, "Yeah, okay." So I basically got the soundboard with the the cast iron harp and all the strings on it, and put that on an easel like uh, stand, and retuned it to the just diatonic scale, um, and played it with marimba mallets, and I called that the hammer strings. And then uh, it got to where, well, I just couldn't stand it anymore. I had to build a bass marimba. So I built a bass marimba, and it was a kind of a rudimentary one. It had 2 octaves of the diatonic scale, and it had one big cave resonator. It didn't have individual resonators, but it was strong and resonant. It shook the floor, and I began to dance immediately as soon as I struck it. Um, it was quite an experience, and so a very small group of musicians in Honolulu joined me in my basement to explore what we could do with that. We never had a performance. It was all research. We did make one album of recordings, and parts of that still exist. Not all of it. It was on magnetic tape, which degraded over the years. But by the time that I was able to turn it on, copy it into digital format, some of it still exists. Um, but anyway, yeah, that was the beginning. And then I thought, what I'm really missing is wind instruments. Now, I played recorder at the time, so I thought, well, I'll make a recorder uh, in this tuning. And I thought, well, I know that the lowest note will correspond with the length of the tube with all the holes plugged up. So I'll start with a tube that has no holes, and find a length that will be the right pitch for my lowest note. And I thought, well, I'll start with a nice long tube and see, give myself plenty of room for error. Well, it was long enough that when I blew on it, a sequence of pitches came out instead of one, and had to do with my wavering breath pressure. And I stopped and I thought, could that possibly be what I think it is? Because I was familiar with the harmonic series, the sound of the harmonic series from my electronic music, sweeping resonant filter over a sawtooth wave. I would be able to hear all the different harmonics, though I didn't understand their actual nature. I just knew that sound. So I more carefully focused my breath and the shape of my mouth, and was able to work it out. I could actually play individual harmonics, and I thought, well, that's like what the bugle does. So I played some bugle calls, and it worked. And I knew then, okay, this is the harmonic series, and it's got a lot of the pitches that I would use, and it's got some interesting other pitches. Well, what are these? And I went back to Parker's book and saw, what those other pitches were, and saw that he saw them as being essential for the new music that he was creating. So I thought, well, that would gotta be essential for my music too. And then I realized that the diatonic scales that I had put all that effort into weren't enough. And so I started expanding them, adding sevenths, and I was hesitant to go to 11 right away because it sounded really strange to me at first. I had never heard anything like that. Couldn't believe that parts thought it was consonant. But I worked with the seventh and integrated the ninth, and which was already there, as parts said. Um, and then gradually got myself into listening to the 11th harmonic using the organ. And um, was never able to really use it melodically. Well, actually, I had to because the fiddle pipe, which is what I called that wind instrument, that it was the long tube with no holes in it that was played with a recorder mouthpiece. Um, um, the closest thing resembling a diatonic scale on that instrument, the fourth was not a 4/3 as would have been in the diatonic. It was the 11/8, and the sixth was not a 5/3. It was a 13/8, and of course the seventh I was already familiar with. So I just started playing melodies with that, and eventually it didn't sound as weird to me because I started to hear that it had different characteristics than the diatonic scale, but it was related to the diatonic scale. And one of the questions that Parts had sort of given me the key to be able to answer. In my previous research, I had found um, an old esoteric document from probably around the 1300s or something like that, um, that indicated a uh, well, actually, no. This was this was a more modern. It was probably 19th, written in the 19th century, but it showed this old thing, and it gave frequencies um, of pitches that were in this old scale that had been used for esoteric purposes, including healing. Um, and the pitches were not the ones that I found in the modern uh, books about what the pitches of the orchestra were, and that
Would
was
were those pitches connected to JI? Like, were they justly tuned?
well. That was one of my big questions because I didn't know. You know, the book that I read didn't explain what how the scale was constructed. It just gave those frequencies, and uh, and that was the biggest question in my quest from basically from 1968,
Hmm.
trying to understand, which led to my traveling all over the country, um, talking to all the composers and theorists that I could meet, and uh, stopping at all the libraries that I could get access to, and visiting all the studios, and just trying to find out the answer to that question. And then Parks answered it for me when I got back to Honolulu and found his book in the library.
Yeah,
So
because it was in the book.
it was in the book the whole time. I didn't know he had written a book. I had been playing his music on my radio show, but I didn't know what he was doing. I just liked it, every time I played his music, I would get calls, and people say, "What is that?" It sounds so. Some people thought it was just weird and wished I would play more classical music, but um, some people really enjoyed it, and it was just new music as far as I was concerned. But then once I read his book and understood what he was doing, it answered my basic questions. And so then, by that time, I had to leave Honolulu and come back to the mainland. My time in Hawaii, I had 9 years there. My time was up.
Hmm.
I had to come back to the mainland, and
So
eventually I.
with instrument creation, then, do you find I'm wondering if I should ask a question for anyone who's listening to the podcast who maybe wants to make their own instruments. I notice a pattern, I think maybe with you and Harry Parch and myself, actually, where a lot of the times the materials to get these instruments are actually things that other people have thrown away that they don't think are useful anymore. Would you say that's a fairly accurate statement?
Well, for me, it certainly was. I couldn't afford to go out and buy all that stuff new. So, yeah, I would just recycle stuff that I found. Like my chimes were made out of fence posts and um, uh, uh, ship's masts and whatever I could find. And the hammer strings was made from an old piano. Um, the My drums were made from PVC pipe that had been thrown out from water projects, and um, uh, so on and so forth. I just, whatever I would find, I would try to figure out how to get sound out of it, and then somehow make an instrument out of it.
Absolutely. And Harry Parch's Spoils of War come to mind as well.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't have access to any big artillery shells, so I couldn't try that one.
Yeah. So you had to leave Honolulu and then come to the States. And so did any of the exotic music ensemble instruments come with you then?
No. I had to give them all away uh, in order to come to the mainland because shipping them across the ocean would have been prohibitive. Um, I did keep a few marimba bars, the wooden xylophone bars, I should say, and I kept a few of the uh, aluminum tubes that were tuned, already tuned, and a few like telephone bells and uh, some recorder mouthpieces and things like that. But very very little. It was just enough so that I'd have something to start with uh, when I got another opportunity, and that stuff stayed in storage for a long time, about 15 years until um, I got a job at a theater in Sarasota, Florida, um, where I was helping to build the sets and uh, doing the lights and sound for the shows. And so I had access to the shop where we built the sets and the props and stuff. Uh, at night, after the play was over and everybody went home, I became the ghost of the theater,
Yeah.
and used the shop to build some instruments. That's where I built my first hammer strings, and uh, where I built the made some more fiddle pipes, and expanded my tubular bell set, and got hold of a digital synthesizer, which was a whole new thing in those days. Um, that It was a Yamaha DX100,
Mm-hmm.
which was a little portable thing. They had a smaller keyboard than normal, um, and it was owned by the theater, and it was an unusual uh, digital synthesizer because um, it had the FM synthesis um, that had been developed by John Chowning at um, Stanford University back in the 70s. And I got to meet John a few times at Stanford, and got some demonstrations of what he was doing there. It was just mind-blowing what he could do. Um, but anyway, it finally got translated into a Yamaha synthesizer, and the keys were uh, equal tempered spaced, but the operators were tunable. So I tuned. There were four operators, that is, like digital oscillators, and they were intended to be used to modulate each other in order to get these FM sounds. But I started tuning them into just chords so that I could get a 4, 5, 6, 7 chord, for instance, or I could get a 6, 7, 9 chord. Um, and by playing, what I wound up doing was holding down a pitch key and basically playing chords with the um, the buttons that change the the patches or the sounds that were intended to use, and that way I could uh, I could play a a 4, 5, 6, say on C, and then if I played a 6, 7, 9 chord on G, they would both be part of the same harmonic series. And so I worked out a way that by combining the pitch keys, the equal tempered pitch keys, with the 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 I'm trying to remember what you called in analog times we called them patches.
Oh yeah, I
It,
think we still call them that today. So you had this synthesizer had a keyboard part that you could play, but it also had patches built in, like modular patches.
sort of, yeah, yeah. It was basically just um, four oscillators, four sine wave oscillators that you could uh, tune each one to different ratios with each other, and so that was some rudimentary music, and the 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 the, the, the piece that I used that on, that you can really hear what's going on, was on an album that I created there at the theater that I called Starlit Journey, because I figured this was the beginning of a musical journey that I was going to be on for decades. And I was beginning in the dark, out in the desert, with uh, just what I had already to start with, and so I just pictured myself on a camel, um, going out in the Arabian desert, at night, just with only the stars as my guide. And so anyway, one of the, I think it might have been the second piece. Yeah, the second piece on that album was called Reggae. Reggae had been pretty popular for a while at that time, and I wanted to honor it in some way. So um, I I used that instrument to create what sort of sounded a little bit like a jazz organ, I guess, but it was using these just chords, using the harmonic series. Um,
You know, I
and
heard one of your. I was looking online and I heard a piece of music of yours called reggae that was
Yeah,
in. It was. I think it was part of a compilation album that I saw. Is that one of the songs from Starlight Journey?
um, I don't remember putting it on a compilation, but maybe somebody else got it and put it on a compilation. Um, but yeah, the lead instrument was a fiddle pipe, and there was that DX100 playing the organ sound, and I had uh, I think it was called the RX-17 Yamaha uh, drum machine with a pre-programmed reggae beat, and so that was how I created reggae.
Yes, I have. So from some of the pieces I found on the internet, um, there's one compilation that I see that's called "From the Pages of Experimental Musical Instruments, Volume 2." Um, features quite a few other composers as well, including Warren Burt and Terpstra, actually, just microtonalists I recognize. And then it's got two of yours. One of them is called Study Number Two, which is monophonic, and one of them is called Reggae.
Yes, I forgot all about that. Yes, that I remember now. Uh, yeah, I remember participating in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had totally forgotten that I'd even participated in that. So thank you for reminding me. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, of course. That's great stuff. I really love the sort of high like growling pinging sounds you're able to get out of the guitar, I think, using the sound of just intonation. Do you have any particular scales you would say are the ones that you've settled on? I know you're very into just intonation, but I was wondering, like, if there's any kind of scale that you've arrived at over time that you always like to use with the instruments, or which instruments are tuned to what scale, etc. Because I know Harry Partch, for instance, tuned some of his instruments to subsets of the scale and then had other instruments play most of the scale. Um, so I was just wondering if there was, like, yeah, a scale that you've settled on. Um,
Yes, yes. By the time that um, that I built my second ensemble in Florida, I already knew my scale was the natural harmonic series, because that's the scale that my fiddle pipes actually dictated for me, and so uh, the goal that I set um, there from then on when I created Starlit Journey, um, and then I contacted the music department at New College in Sarasota, uh, to see if they would be interested in having me do a workshop for their students to become familiar with the elements of musical acoustics and how they could be applied to composition. And the professor, he was real mellow. It was Ron Little. He said, no, we're not really interested in that, but do you have a degree? And I was real apologetic. I said, no, I never got that far. He said, well, why don't you come and get one? And I said, well, I can't afford that. And he said, we'll take care of that. Come on over. So I did, and I brought him Starlit Journey, and he got me all introduced to everybody I needed to know. And uh, that following year, I began uh, studying composition at New College uh, with total funding. And
Amazing.
it was amazing, all right. Yeah, he just knew that, he could tell just from my phone call that, I belonged there. So I did, and by the time I graduated, I had all my instruments were really developed well, and I had some software that I had developed. I had been able to accumulate some other resources and was ready to go. So came to Gainesville and set up my instruments. Just magically was able to fall into this uh, house on 11 acres of forest just outside of town. And I was able to bicycle to the University of Florida where I did some graduate work. And um, invited some friends that they were actually friends of my son, who had just gotten out of the army and brought some of his friends, and they had a house in Gainesville. So my first friends were his friends, and I invited them over to try out my instruments, and some of them were really interested and kept coming back, and so we gradually formed the beginnings of the first Exotic Music Ensemble. And since I was doing some graduate work there at the University of Florida, um, it was in the summer. It was after I had graduated New College and before I started uh, uh, um, UF. Um, I had already been invited uh, by the faculty there at UF to use a room in the basement of their auditorium to house my instruments. And so I invited some of the professors there. One was world music professor. Well, actually, he was Brazilian music, um, and the other was the electronic music professor. So I had something in common with each of them, and I was a little older than either of them, quite a bit older actually. But anyway, yeah, they liked my instruments and jammed with me and stuff. And then the um, um, there was a art museum that wanted to do a exhibit on futuristic art, and so they contacted uh, the music department and wanted to know if there was anybody they could recommend that could do futuristic music for the exhibit, and they recommended me. So our I set up a gig with them. It gave me enough time to rehearse my immediate group, which consisted of about 5 people, maybe 6, and uh, we just barely had a little repertoire that we could perform, but we at least we had something, and uh, we all wore colorful costumes and um, um, came out and played. And it was at a time when the media in Gainesville was wishing there was something they could cover. There wasn't
Oh.
any. There wasn't anything going on at the time, and they were basically hungry for something to cover, and so they came to this concert, and we got really covered well, and it kicked off my 7-year career there in Gainesville. Um, got immediately famous, was in the newspaper and on the radio, and um, other other venues were interested in having us play. Um,
That sounds like such a fulfilling experience. Did you write all of the music that was performed at the exhibit?
yes.
Gotcha.
Oh, except for one piece, um, the William Tell Overture. Um, oh, that was such a fun piece that even though it was all of the music was basically inspired, except for a couple of pieces that were just basically uh, what evolved out of my experiments with the harmonic series. Um, um, were inspired by my impressions of music I had heard of other cultures. Like there was one piece that was my impressions of the Indonesian gamelan, even though it wasn't anything like the authentic gamelan, but it resembled it from my perspective in the beginning. Um, and we played a Middle Eastern dance kind of thing, and uh, and the one thing that I wanted to be sure of was that nothing was in 4/4 rhythm or even 3/4. Everything had to be in 5/7, 11, something like that, 12, 13, um, and so that gave me a way to not only be unique, but um, to actually get started exploring what kind of music really could come out of this tuning in a using odd rhythms and polyrhythms. And another one of the basic concepts I wanted to um, explore was the use of polyrhythms in just ratios, so that like Henry Cowell had written a book in 1920 called New Musical Resources, where he talked about expanding the scale using the natural harmonic series and expanding harmony by expanding rhythm by applying the principles of just intonation harmony to rhythm, so that you would have a polyrhythm of say 4/5, um, or better yet, let's say 6/7/9, which would be like a G sub minor chord resolving to 4/5/6, which would be like a C major chord. Um, and he had examples of what that, how that could kind of work, although it wasn't very musical. The
Right.
examples, they were just theoretical ideas. Um, And I didn't understand the just intonation part the first time I read it because it was before I read parts, but it has always been interesting to me, and he even outlined ways to notate that sort of thing. So anyway, one of the goals that I had for the Exotic Music Ensemble was to see what kind of music could come out of using the natural harmonic series itself as a scale. Um, I had read that all the intervals in um, in standard music theory were derived from the uh, uh, natural harmonic series, and that all the expansions of musical resources had come by integrating new harmonics, such as like in the medieval times they only had three limit um, uh, music, and then um, it eventually evolved into five limit, and then by the time of Bach, seven limit was starting to be implied, although it wasn't being used yet. Um, and certainly by the 19th century, seven limit was being used. Um, at least, where keyboard instruments were dominating in scene. Um, and so anyway, I wanted to see, well, since I already had these fiddle pipes, which could only play in the natural harmonic series, why don't I explore what kind of music could actually come out of using the harmonic series itself
And
with all.
when you say the harmonic series and the scales you have, I'm looking on the site here and I see that things are tuned to particular harmonics and subharmonics. Does that mean that like if you were to say like harmonics 8 to 16, you'd have a scale that would be like, you know, 1 over 1 and then 9 over 8, 5 over 4, 11 over 8, 3 over 2, 13 over 8, 7 over 4, 15 over 8, and then like the octave again. Would you
Yeah,
do things like that? Yeah. Okay.
yeah, that's what I was doing. Though eventually I had to go out further um, than that because um, when I started changing the fundamentals to different subharmonics, um, I needed more in order to do smooth changes between the different tonalities. I had to um, I had to have more semitone-like intervals, and so I went out to 17, and um, then it was natural to integrate 19 into it as well. And the next step was 21, which I already had anyway because it was the seventh harmonic of the three. So uh, eventually it wound up being 19 limit, though I only called it 17 limit. But
Because the 19 limit interval from the harmonic series, 19 over 16, probably wasn't used as often.
well, I used it a lot, but it was so close to the equal tempered version of 6/5
Yeah.
that I didn't give it a whole lot of attention. I just used it. Um, but the like for instance the the xylophone that I used um, had that repeating scale of 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, skipped 23, went right to 24 because there wasn't another block for the 23. Skipped 25 for the same reason. 26, 27, 28, skipped 29, went to 30, skipped 31, and then went to 32. So I could do all that on a 12-tone xylophone that I retuned.
So
Um,
you were also using those scales in such a way that you get approximately 12 tones per octave, but it's not 12 tone equal temperament.
exactly, yes. Um,
Gotcha.
on some instruments I was able to just, the ones I built myself, I was able to put the scales on that I wanted. But I had to compromise a little bit with adapted instruments.
Yeah, of course. I'm reading, of course, about the instruments in the orchestra. I think we already talked a little bit about the bass marimba and the hammer strings. I see the hammer strings here. How do you play the hammer strings? Because I see a bunch of overlapping adjacent strings, and I feel like it would be hard to get to a lot of them.
Well, I had to restring it um, before I returned it, um, so that I had banks of unisons. Um, like on the bass end, that's where the big bass strings were going off from the bottom to the from the center of the bottom over to the upper left. In other words, that were tilted to the left, the big ones on the those had big banks, like there were six, I believe it was six middle C's of 256 hertz, and then just below that was about four, I think, of the G's below that, and then about six of the C's below that, and then uh, an attempt to get a subharmonic series one string at a time down to the bottom of the lowest C, which was the one-to-one of the whole system. And then on the middle rank, I had uh, four strings tuned to the E 5/4, and then a space, and then four strings on the G 3/2, and then a space, and then another rank of 7/4, and then another space, and so on, up to 16 uh, at, at the at the end of the middle rank, and then up above that was 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and on like that. Um, and actually, back back at the beginning, I had tried to get that upper octave and instead decided I needed to have the subharmonic series somehow represented. So I retuned that highest bank to the subharmonic series in a very high register. Um, and the reason for that was that I had already made a aluminum tubular bell instrument that had subharmonic series 2 through 12. Uh,
Yes, I see that instrument as well on this page. Would you say the hammer strings are the most difficult instrument to tune in the exotic music ensemble?
yeah, yeah. In fact, that was a basic exercise for my students was to tune the hammer strings because it always needed to be tuned, and so it was a good exercise in tuning up the ear as well as uh, the instrument itself.
Yeah. I see. I'm looking around at the other instruments here too, and wanting to know the origins of many of them. I see that the Cosmo lyre and the fretless electric guitar and bass that Buzz Kimball and Ivor Darreg were involved in their construction. Would you care to explain how those came to be?
Sure. Um, Ivor had been playing Hawaiian uh, uh, lap steel guitar um, in an effort to explore new pitches and relationships of pitches. And he found it to be really interesting, but it didn't have enough strings to suit him for all his experiments. So he wanted to build um, something on that order that had more strings. And he was just as poor as I was. He had lots of imagination and ideas for things, but he didn't have money to buy materials, so he just used what he had available to him. So he got an old wooden 4x4 that had been what he called a newel post, which I think is the the front uh, the front of a banister, a stair banister, a wooden stair banister. So anyway, he used that as um, uh, something to uh, put some old piano tuners on, and uh, some homemade bridges and things like that, and um, experimented with it. And then he understood electronics. He had actually built an organ that could retune to just an intonation by itself. He tuned it in 17 equal, and then whenever he would play a chord, it would automatically drift into just ratios. Um, so anyway, yeah, he understood magnetism and all that. So he made some pickups, just winding copper wire around a magnet, and uh, it put it under the strings, and he had pickups. Um, so yeah, he experimented. He made several prototypes of the Cosmo Lyre, and uh, Buzz Kimball at one point was living in his car out in front of Ivor's house so that he could uh, study with Ivor as much as possible, and wound up with one of the prototypes that Ivor didn't uh, need to keep. And eventually he went back to New Hampshire where he lived, and uh, rewound some pickups. He made some new pickups for it that were a little bit better than the ones that Ivor had made. And and then uh, when he and I got to know each other, I don't remember how we got to know each other, but oh yeah, he contacted me because of an article that appeared somewhere. I don't remember if it was the Just Intonation Network newsletter or if it was the microtonal uh, uh, the Johnny Reinhardt's publication. I don't remember what it was, but somehow he found out about me and contacted me by mail, and we began a correspondence, and eventually he wanted to come down and do a residency at the Just Intonation Center in Gainesville, which evolved out of the ensemble I described a little while ago. And he brought this Cosmo lyre with him, and I had a steel drum like they used in the Caribbean that I didn't want or need, and so he wanted it, and so we traded. Ivor's Cosmo lyre came to me, and that steel drum went to him.
Ah, I see. And then how about the electric guitar and the electric bass that became fretless?
Hmm. The the bass, um, I just pulled the frets out of it and filled in the cracks with epoxy, and then I was able to play any pitches I wanted to that were within its range. Um, and the guitar, um, I had the guitar back in Hawaii, um, and it was a regular equal tempered guitar that I had played in a kind of a rock band uh, before I got into my just intonation experiments. And uh, that rock band didn't last very long, uh, but I met some Indian musicians and became really interested in the music of India. So I started playing sort of pseudo Indian music on the electric guitar, and uh, then when I discovered parts, I was real interested in uh, refretting that guitar so that um, it could it could play the just intervals.
Yeah,
And
that makes sense. So just going over the Exotic Music Ensemble to make sure, I don't know if all the instruments on the site are correct. The afn.org site, with SCJIC there in the address. There's the bass marimba, the Cosmo lyre, the hammer strings, the harmonic series xylophone, the lambdoma xylophone, the tubular bells, the lambdoma chimes, the big drums, the hand drums, the rototoms, the fretless electric guitar and bass, the fipple pipes, the interchangeable fretboard guitar, the harmonic cannons, the starboards, and the theremin slash synthesizer. Is that that's the entire exotic music ensemble in Florida?
well, that was the essence of it. Yeah, there were some other instruments as well that came and went. A lot of accessories, uh, tambourines and rain sticks and
Yeah.
maracas and stuff like that. Uh, Various wind instruments that came and went, and
Oh yeah, you
um,
mentioned the recorders. Yeah.
hmm oh yeah, yeah. One of the basic instruments that I used in the Gainesville ensemble was I had a tunable Yamaha synthesizer. Um, Actually, I had a couple. I had a DX50, which was a keyboard instrument, and had uh, the essential stuff that was in the TX81C, but it was more developed. And then I had a couple of TX81Cs as well, and I played all that with um, uh, a, I'm trying to remember the the manufacturer, but it was in the shape of a saxophone, of a small saxophone,
What?
and
So like, was the keyboard? Is it like a keyboard on there, or was it like buttons that you would press and you would get
it
synthesizer
it,
tones?
it fingered like a recorder.
Oh,
Um,
okay, I see.
um, and it had a MIDI output, and so I controlled the Yamaha synthesizers with that.
Oh, that's
And
a really novel way to control those. I think there's things like that nowadays called a UI. I don't know if you've ever heard of those, like
a
EWI.
called a what?
Like called a UI, like EWI. I think it stands for electronic wind instrument.
Um, well, I remember Yamaha had something, um, and somebody else had another model, but they were all too expensive for me to buy. Um, and so I just used this taper thing.
Yeah.
Actually, come to think of it, I didn't have to buy that. It was donated by Tony Horowitz, who was one of the sponsors of my thesis at New College. And he
Hmm.
had been in. Oh, there was actually a second version of the Exotic Music Ensemble I forgot about. In between Honolulu and Gainesville, I did one at New College that had a couple of professors and a few students involved.
So the Exotic Music Ensemble, as far as I can tell, it goes with you, and wherever you are, there's Exotic Music Ensemble happening. Are the instruments from the Gainesville, Florida Exotic Music Ensemble, where are they right now? Are they just hanging out at the university? Is anyone using them to make music?
Well, most of them uh, are gone. They were either given to friends or sold or something like that when I had to leave Gainesville in um, the late 90s and relocated to California for a few years. Um, and so they all went to the Florida School of Massage for a little while. And uh, thanks to the Florida School of Massage that actually built a building to house them um, while I was away. Um, they were there, and Josh Letterman, who had been, well, actually, before Josh got into it, um, Darren Burgess, who worked at the massage school and had been one of my students, um, uh, wanted to rebuild a carillon that had been donated to World Harmony Project by a cemetery in Jacksonville. Um, it was a electrically operated and amplified carillon. It sounded like the big bells uh, of a real bell tower, but it was electrically produced. Um, and his project was to retune it to the harmonic series scale that I was using.
It's a really big, ambitious project. I'm sure the listeners of the podcast are really going to appreciate all of the background detail. One thing I wanted to ask you was about the World Harmony Project, because you said earlier that website was defunct. So I'd love it if you just gave kind of like an explanation of what the World Harmony Project is and how it's connected to your interests of music and healing.
Yeah, when I first got to Gainesville after graduating from New College and landed on this 11-acre property that I got a 7-year lease for, um, and would still be there now if the owner hadn't died and I couldn't renew the lease. Um, but anyway, it was a perfect place for my base of operations where I could rehearse I could house my instruments, I could rehearse the ensemble, and I could have students there to learn, and I could, have guests come and interact. And I needed a nonprofit organization uh, so that uh, we'd have a tax exempt place where people could make donations and where we wouldn't be burdened by taxation for the money that we got from concerts and stuff like that. Which we didn't really ever make profits,
Right.
but we tried to at least pay the bills. So we um, got together with some friends that understood legal things, and we formed a nonprofit organization called the Southeast Just Intonation Center. And the, um, nobody understood what that meant. They thought it had something to do with uh, social justice or something. They just didn't understand what it really was. Um, but we went through it for about a year, and then um, after we had all these experiences, which I didn't describe in this one, although the last time we talked, I did mention how we did the Festival of World Music and Culture, um, uh, where we had 20 different acts on the stage in one day, um, and vendors that represented the cultures from those uh, uh, those cultures that were represented by the music and dance on the stage. Um, and we were able to draw about maybe 1,500 people from uh, various parts of the community. There was the Indian Cultural Center. There was the um, Chinese Cultural Center. There was the Philippines and Pacific Cultural Center. There were several existing groups of people that wanted to come to the festival to see the acts that were representing their culture, and in being able to be there for that, they got exposed to all the other acts as well, and they got to try the food and see the products that were represented by the vendors, and they got to rub elbows with all the different people that were there, and so it drew people together who normally wouldn't have ever met or even knew about each other, and some people became friends through through those events,
It
and
sounds like it. It sounds like it accomplished a lot. Then you get that cross cultural pollination that is so helpful and beneficial for these kinds of events. I think it's very historically significant and makes a big impact.
well, thank you for that. Yeah, that was the general impression that people came away with. Um, and so we decided that a better name for the Southeast Just Intonation Center, since nobody understood what it was, um, we called it the World Harmony Project. The Southeast Just Intonation Center became a division of the World Harmony Project.
Obviously, it reaches into so many different areas, and I wish we could talk about it more since you have so much output that might necessarily not be online for the next generations who are looking into you for the first time. If you could give kind of a summary of a lot of the music that you've released, been a part of, things like that, like kind of like your discography in a sense.
Well, what's available? I'll tell you that. I mean, there's
Yeah.
no point going into stuff that I don't have anymore.
Right. Right.
But there are remnants from the early experiments in Hawaii that amounts to about a half an hour. And I don't have a name for that. I just, you know, it's a collection of, of music of basically historical interest. It's not, well, it does have musical value, but not to the extent of the music that came later because it was all experiments. Um, and then in Sarasota, when I was working at the theater, I did an album called Starlit Journey, and uh, that was the first of the more modern era for me. Um, and then at New College, after that, I produced another album of music that I was doing then called PRMJI, which was mostly, well, it was all electronic music using uh, my Yamaha synthesizers that were tunable, like the TX-81Cs and the DX-50, um, along with uh, the program I had written, microtonal MIDI terminal, and Dr. T's keyboard keyboard sequencer on the Atari ST, um, as well as I was using Cakewalk sometimes um, on the PC. Um, and so I was able to use that studio that I had in my bedroom at the time um, to uh, make musical examples of the things I was describing in my thesis, and so that was an important work, I thought, and it contained some of the seeds for music that I later developed in Gainesville with the acoustic instruments. Um, and the product of the Gainesville group was an album that we called New Music, Ancient Principles. And that's as far as my recordings that exist go. I wish I had some of the earlier recordings that I'd done, but I don't. Um, and there's a possibility I might do another album. I had thought maybe I was over with it all, but um, people still, when they come over and they see my instruments, they get excited and say they want to come and play. But one of the traditions in Gainesville is to get excited and say you're going to do something and then don't do
That's a
it.
Gainesville thing, huh?
Well, it seems like it, but I guess maybe it's going on everywhere by now, probably. But you look like a real exception to that. I'd really like to know you better because you seem to not be in that category at all.
Well, I try to do stuff. I'm usually, if I have any time to myself and I'm doing something with music, I'm trying to do something microtonal because it's a good uphill challenge. I have to ask also how you were dealing with polyrhythmic techniques, and I know this is very hard to summarize, but with your thesis project, polyrhythmic music and just intonation, and the Exotic Music Ensemble in Gainesville, did you have different strategies for getting polyrhythms to be played? Like, were you taking advantage of the electronics to create polyrhythms that were really, really hard for humans to play? How did the polyrhythms differ between the two projects?
Um, well, the way I figured out the polyrhythms was I would take the two numbers of a ratio, like say it's 3 and 2, um, and multiply them together. 2 times 3 is 6. So then I'd get a piece of graph paper and I'd work out a sequence of 6 squares on the graph and space them out to get the 3. I'd do every other square, and then below it to get 2, I'd do every third square. And so then I could see if I were to use um, a 6-beat tick pattern, then on the first beat, on the first tick, I should say, I would play both notes. And then the second tick, there would be nothing. On the third tick, I'd play the, the top rhythm. The fourth tick, there would be nothing. On the fifth, on the fourth tick, there would be the bottom one. And then the fifth tick, there would be nothing. And then the sixth tick, there would be nothing. So that way I could space it out. And I would, like in my piece 5 in 5, I used 2 under 5 a whole lot.
Yeah.
And then there was one section where I was playing 3 over the 5 over the 2. So I had 2, 3, 5 going on at one time. And so I was able to figure that one out by multiplying 3 times 5 is 15, times 2 is 30.
Yeah.
And,
You know, I think I saw a really great interview from someone about your Gainesville, Florida album, New Music Ancient Principles. I'm trying to track it down really fast.
If you got a moment, I'll just tell you that
Yes.
New Music Ancient Principles was the basic slogan of my music.
Ah, yeah, great.
From the beginning.
That. Very, very Harry Partch-esque in the best way.
Yeah, he was my biggest inspiration, probably.
Did you ever get to meet him?
I missed him by 1 year. When I made my tour in 1975, he had just died.
Oh, yeah. That's the shame. Yeah.
But I did get to meet Jonathan Glazer, who had been in his ensemble and who took care of him when he was aging before he died.
Yes. Very inspiring. Talk to you later. Thanks so much for being on this episode.
Well, thank you so much for your interest, Stephen. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the 21st century audience.
Of course.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Yeah.